In the studio right here with us is the East Africa Director for Human Rights Watch, Otieno Namwaya. Karibu sana to the Situation Room.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this morning. Good to have you in the studio. Also joining us on the line is Irungo Houghton, who is the Executive Director of Amnesty International, and we'll have a chat with him in a short while as well. Okay, before we kick off the hour, CT, today's proverb.
Asifuye mvua imemnyea. Put in colloquial Kiswahili, yule ambaye mvua imenyeshea yeye ndio anasifu mvua. But the proverb says, asifuye mvua imemnyea. He who praises the rain has been rained on.
It can also be interpreted, depending on your outlook, as keep your enemies close. Depending on your outlook.
You know, that one is going to require a little explanation, isn't
I'm
it?
telling you.
Yes.
I just remember what you said a couple of days ago when you said the thing about proverbs is that they're open to interpretation.
Yes. It depends on your outlook.
And it's wide. And you cannot say that one interpretation is actually better than the other. Not really. So long as that's the sense it makes to the person who understands it, it's perfectly all right. I mean, think of this particular proverb being mentioned to somebody who resides in the desert. They don't see rain very often. So when you talk about the rain, he'll say, okay, nice proverb, but
I don't
Doesn't
understand
mean
what
anything.
you're saying.
why don't you give us a proverb about the sun? Or about the sand? Makes more sense.
Tell us something else. Okay, so Wajiro,
Yeah.
the IMF and the
Right.
government, hands together
Yeah.
many months ago said, you know what, we need some help here in order to be able to get onto the road for recovery.
Yeah.
And IMF said, all right, we can step in to help. However, there's certain things that we need to put in place to make sure that even if we do help here and there with the injection of much needed funds, is to put some things in place to get us on the road to recovery. COVID-19 also came in, and it was largely on that a lot of these things were hedged. And to say, all right, let's start out and see what we can do. Plan was put in place. We saw some of the things and we were told in advance that, we're going to feel a bit of the pinch here and there. But what we're trying to do is get on the road to recovery. An overview. Where are we right now? What is happening and how can we say progress is being or not being felt?
Yeah, thanks, Drew, for even giving us that backdrop. And if you allow me, I'll just say the initial $739 million was given by the IMF, was lent or made available in, very important, because we are going to pay for this thing, interest-free. It was made available in the form of an interest-free loan under the Rapid Credit Facility. And this was against the backdrop of COVID. Kenya had been negotiating with the IMF since 2019 because we were already in debt crisis. IMF was not really feeling us. They were saying, go and do things like raise taxes, blah, 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 blah. And government of Kenya was resisting. When COVID came, because of the economic consequence, the economic impact, Kenya had an opportunity and was then able to access this money. Then government proceeded to put together a COVID response strategy. Part of the COVID response was purchase of PPEs, and we know how that went through the KEBSA corruption scandal. The other was to put in place the household cash transfer program targeting the vulnerable, which Human Rights Watch reviewed and has really talked about since the report was published, I think in June of this year, about who actually got that money and what was the role of government officers, who benefited instead of Kenyans. The other facility that was created under this support was there was a business support program that was set up targeting MSMEs. And again, a report by the National Bankers Association showed that less than 5% of MSMEs benefited from this money. Now, this is money loaned to Kenya. It's money that we're going to have to pay back. The EACC came in, investigated, gave recommendations for the prosecution of some big names, top government officials, as well as businessmen who are involved in the KEMSA procurement scandal. The Auditor General then proceeded to prepare a report on the same. And the last point I'll make is that as Kenya entered into the fiscal consolidation program in 2021, making Kenya eligible to then access 2.4 billion USD, because we needed to get into the fiscal consolidation to get this money, one of the conditions of the IMF was that the perpetrators of corruption around COVID funds be prosecuted. Right? And it is one of the milestone deliverables. So government of Kenya has proceeded to present the audit report, but have the prosecutions happened?
That is a good question. And even as we go to that and maybe hear a little bit then from Otieno, let's welcome joining us also online today, Irungu Houghton, the Executive Director of Amnesty International. Irungu, it's been a minute. Good morning.
Good morning, and thanks again for having me on.
Karibu sana to the Situation Room. You're no stranger here, having a discussion this morning, and it's good to have you here with us. So Otieno, as we just hearing that background from Wanjiru and saying that here we are in this situation whereby the road to recovery was mapped out, it would be seen as though agreements were made in terms of what is supposed to happen. Where are we now? What are we looking at now? The situation in which we are in. How far have we gone? And what are some things that we must insist on?
Thank you. I think the background that Wanjiru has given captures quite a bit of what has happened. But then there have been questions as well as to how we have handled the COVID situation, even before you begin to talk about the recovery or where we are heading to. Where have we come from? So like Wanjiru said, there was quite a lot of money that was given to assist the government with response to COVID-19 emergency situation. And it didn't just come from the IMF. We do know that various other bilateral partners like the US, the UK, the EU, I think even China, even Germany did give a lot of money. But nobody knows exactly how much of that money has actually been received by the government. There's no public information on how much money the government received in response to COVID-19. And it's also not clear how much of that money is loan and how much of it is actually just grants. Secondly, the government received that money in order to respond to certain aspects of COVID-19. One of these was health related. The initial stages, it was actually the quarantining of people. It needed to support some of those measures, including subsidizing the cost of hotels for those who are being quarantined, providing testing services, among other things, providing PPEs for the people who are working in those quarantine facilities. From the work we did in May and April last year, the government did nothing of that, none of that. So the question that emerges is, where did the money that was provided for this go?
Otieno, you said the government did none of that. That what was initially prescribed in terms of what was supposed to happen with some of these funds, provision of some of these things, nothing, absolutely nothing happened?
Yes, we do know that people are paying for quarantine themselves. Secondly, if you got admitted, you went to hospital, you were charged for PPEs. So it was not free. So people actually paid, one PPE was paid by several people because everybody who came in paid for PPE. Yet the doctors and other healthcare workers were not replacing these facilities as required. Like one PPE, one overall was supposed to be used maybe in a day by one person. Masks, gloves were supposed to be replaced regularly, maybe hourly, maybe after 2 hours. But what we know that has happened is that the overalls that were being used for several days by doctors, masks and gloves were not being replaced. In fact, there are some which were used over and over. So the government didn't buy these facilities. And when it bought them, they were of very low quality, because people just went to do business. People are doing business rather than responding to the emergency. So that is quarantine. The second thing was the cash transfers. Now, this was supposed to be economic response to COVID-19. And the government and partners agreed to target the vulnerable communities and help them alleviate the impact of COVID-19. And money was set aside. If you look at the IMF website, it states clearly the amounts of money that were given specifically to go to cash transfers. If you talk to government, the money that was set aside was 10 billion. The government says all that money came from the treasury. Not a single cent came from the donor. You know what that means? You provide a service, but you set aside two separate budgets. So the donor-funded one and the government one. Once you provide the service, both budgets disappear, and you provide accounting for both of them. So the donors fund this fully, but you also withdraw money from the government claiming that's funding. That's called double dipping. So that likely happened. But even the 10 billion that was spent, whether it came from the government or the donors, was not spent properly. Initially, the government had projected to be able to support 600,000 households. So each household approximately has 4 to 5 people. So if you calculate that, was supposed to be 2.4 million people in Nairobi alone in informal settlements. However, from government records, they claim they supported 334 households, 34,000 households. In reality, when you look at when you start doing your own research, you realize the government claims that these people received money from between April 27th to November, end of November 28th, thereabouts, 2020. However, from the government's own admission, when President Kenyatta was announcing that now we are beginning to do this for the vulnerable people on May 23rd of 2020, he was already saying that they are sending out 250 million per week. However, we do know that the whole of April and part of May, they were doing what they were calling piloting. And piloting was done in Nairobi alone. And they were supporting just about 9,000 households. After they finished piloting, they moved that to 75,000 households in Nairobi alone, and then expanded it to 17 other counties. So if 250 million was going to out every week in April, who was it going to?
These are crazy admissions, obviously, and I want to bring in Irungu at this point. Irungu, from your experience and maybe information that has come to you as well, who have benefited? If we're talking about recovery and the plans that have been put in place so far, who has benefited from this? Truth be told, the situation on the ground, as it were. Are we seeing a situation where Kenyans actually did benefit? Just taking off of what Otieno has said just now, in terms of cash transfers, for example, it would appear as though what is in the books is not what was the situation on the ground.
So thanks very much for the question. I think I would probably take a slightly different tack, if you allow me, because we have been focusing very much on the new mandates, the vaccine mandates that are there. But let me twist that issue back to your question, which is, if we look at the progress that we've seen since the introduction of the vaccines in March of this year, we have largely seen the vaccines take up to really affect and to benefit those people who are in urban centers. 9%, just under 9%, as we heard from Dr. Willis Khahwale yesterday evening, is just too low a figure. Like only 1 in 10 people have taken the vaccine. And, I think it's really important at this point, as we challenge the scope and the length of the mandate that is being proposed by the government, essentially to lock out citizens from government services or from public spaces or from public transport on the 21st of December if they haven't vaccinated.
Yes.
That, the numbers are still so low that we are still not out of this global killer that is called COVID. And I really want to emphasize that we are, as Amnesty International, we are not trying to increase vaccination skepticism, nor even health ministry skepticism. What we really want to see is a clear public awareness program that leaves the vaccination campaign voluntary, that it leaves it informed, and really in a position where we can begin to address some of the myths that are still there within the vaccine. And one of the ones that we heard from Dr. Halwale last night was really this point around many people still think that taking the vaccine will leave you infertile if you're a woman and impotent if you're a man. And there is no scientific evidence for this case. As Amnesty, we of course not epidemiologists or even medical health specialists, but from all the CDC centers, they are saying that there is no evidence that the vaccines, any of the ones that are prevalent in Kenya, have any impact on reproductive organs, women's fertility, or the ability of men to produce sperm. So I think we have to really focus on education at this point in order to really shift the focus from 1%, rather 10% of the population vaccinated to 90% of the population. But unfortunately, we don't have enough details and enough clarity on how this will be enforced if on the 21st of December, something like 15 million informal workers still haven't gone through their, haven't had their jab. So I think this is the point that we want to raise this morning.
Yeah, I think, thanks so much, Irongo, and also Otieno. There's a common thread in what you're saying is, one, there's a lack of clarity. There's a lack of clarity regarding the money that came in, how it was deployed and to what it was deployed. There are broad policy statements that were made, but, the devil detail is not known. Again, Irongo is also saying it's not clear with regard to the status of these vaccines, because we've been told they are vaccines, these many doses are available. We are not clear how accessible they are, at the health facility level. We are also not clear, like I was saying, the Institute of Economic Affairs has talked about the budget allocations in terms of the money that government has put in being inadequate to cover all Kenyans. And the question I'd like to ask Irongo, what does Amnesty plan to do with this directive? Because government, on one hand, is talking about withholding government services for those who aren't vaccinated. Are we clear that there is access to these vaccines, even if people did want to go that way? And you are talking about using the route of education. I don't know if you've been tracking the process to see, has the initial education that was done, because there was some effort to educate Kenyans around the COVID vaccine and around the COVID pandemic and their response to it. Has there been continued education to enlighten Kenyans? And what strategies should government employ? So there's an accountability question. But like Otieno told us when he started out, even before talking about the financial accountability, there is just the management of the process. So is government managing the vaccine rollout as they should?
That's a great question. I think if you'd asked me this question in July, I would have probably emphatically said that no, that Kenyans were still vulnerable. They did not have access to the vaccines, and fortunately, in August, we saw a massive, influx of vaccines into the country, and therefore, for those people, particularly in the urban areas, not necessarily just the big cities of Mombasa, Nakuru, Kisumu, and Nairobi, but even in other parts of the country, like Nyeri, there were vaccines made available to many Kenyans who took them up, and people came out and registered, and vaccinated. So I think we have to acknowledge that, unlike different parts of the world where there has been huge vaccine skepticism, Kenyans primarily have understood the danger of not being vaccinated, either for themselves or for the people around them, and in particular, the elderly. So I think that's the first thing. Back in April, we, as Amnesty International, we challenged the Ministry of Health to publish disaggregated or broken down data on who actually was getting the vaccine. We did not want to just have blanket numbers. What we wanted to hear was how many of our health workers have vaccinated, how many of our police officers are vaccinated, how many of the elderly, and if possible, even how many of the people that have underlying, medical conditions. Yeah. And it was good to see after about a month this started to happen. And as we know now, based on the information that is coming from the Ministry of Health, that there is very good uptake from at least the law enforcement agencies, from the teachers, and from the health workers. But we have not yet made a dent in terms of the number of the elderly that needs to come forward. And also, for that matter, I have colleagues in 5 different very poor counties, places like Garissa, Kilifi, Tana River. And as they're talking with communities about the need to vaccinate and their experience of the vaccination program, what we're hearing in those places is that for the pastoralists particularly, this is actually very difficult. But I think we really need to focus on getting the vaccines out to those parts of the country that are just still out of where people are just unable to access the vaccines.
Them.
But I think the problem is not so much distribution now. I think we have about 15, from what I heard yesterday, about 15 million doses that will be available in the next month or so, which is a large amount, and it does need to be administered before it expires.
It expires.
So I think the challenge now really is getting people to vaccinate. And anybody who's listening to me who is not vaccinated, we would say please consider strongly and present yourself for vaccination, and also encourage your families to do so. This is the only way that we can not go through another lockdown, not go through another curfew, and also not have this situation on the 21st of December where the government may try and enforce
the vaccination. All right, let's take a break on that note and come back and continue with this conversation. I think a good note to take a break on right now. Nduoko Siti Muga in the studio with you this morning, and the founding trustee and national coordinator of the the Institute for Social Accountability, Tisawa Jiro Gikonyo, is in with us today. We're having a conversation on the road to recovery from COVID-19, what was promised, some of the things that were or were not done. If we're really going to get onto that road to recovery, what are some things that we are insisting on? Having that conversation this morning with the East Africa Director for Human Rights Watch, Otieno Namwaya, as well as the Executive Director for Amnesty International, Irungu Houghton. The conversation continues this morning, and looking at some of those issues. Siti.
Irungu. Good morning. Something I'd like to ask, Irungu, if I may. In how many counties is Amnesty International represented?
I can answer that institutionally. We do not have offices in any other county but the county of Nairobi out of choice. We have 1,700 members, so 1,700 members, and they come from at least 30, I believe, of the 47 counties. So we're actually very actively now working with what we call circles of conscience. These are community-based initiatives that are promoting and protecting human rights.
Super. I mean, that is a good representation. The reason why I ask, one of the things that we have been told is a problem with the issues around the vaccine is people are not certain where it is they can actually get the vaccine. So using your good offices, knowing how well you are connected and how you can talk to people in power, if it is possible for people to actually have the information, so I am in County X. Now, if I want the vaccine, I can get it there. Now, the network of people you have, perhaps this is not your purview, but this is something you could do. Your corporate social responsibility. Let them also help the communities getting to understand where people can get the vaccine or the days in which the vaccine is available. Because part of the problem we have is fatigue. Somebody goes to look for the vaccine, doesn't get it, after a week, they're not going to keep going. They've got other things to do. So we know that the vaccines get to the headquarters of the counties, but thereafter, that information is not very reliable.
CT, could I jump in and bring out a different perspective to the vaccine issue, which is the human rights perspective, with that directive? What is the human, and maybe Otieno can speak to this, what is the human rights position with compelling, threatening to withdraw government services? And can government force Kenyans to vaccinate? I think Kenyans need to vaccinate. It is in our interest to vaccinate, but human rights are equally important. So where do we stand on this? Is government on the right road on this one?
Let me start by saying that states have obligation to protect the people. So when there's a pandemic like coronavirus, the state has an obligation to ensure that either people are vaccinated or those who have been infected are treated. Having said that, however, the states are also required to ensure that the measures they take are lawful and proportionate. So by proportionate, we mean before the government can declare that it will take certain measures to ensure that its obligations are fulfilled or it achieves certain ends, it needs to ask itself whether there was nothing less destructive or less that will cause less harm than the measure that they are taking, that they should have taken. So if before the government declares that we shall not allow you into government offices unless you're vaccinated, the government needs to ask, first of all, how much has it done to sensitize Kenyans and to ensure that Kenyans are aware that they need to be going to vaccinate. And the second thing is how much has government done to ensure that the vaccines are available. So today, we can say that the vaccines are fairly well available if you look at the number of doses that the government is saying is going to be shipping in. But for how long has that been around? For much of this year, Kenya had just about 1.2 million, was it 1.2 or 2 million doses? And they were being administered to specific groups, the doctors, the teachers, the vulnerable groups. So, so for quite some time, Kenyans, the ordinary Kenyans could not do that.
Sorry to cut in. Are you saying that because vaccines are now available, government can then put this requirement to withdraw government services in order to compel people to vaccinate? And if they extended the deadline maybe to March, that it would be in order. So where's the human? I think you're talking about timeline being an aspect. Is this feasible? Can people actually gain access? And then from a human rights perspective, how should government have handled this? What should the reaction of Kenyans be? We've seen what's happening in Europe. People are going up in arms. So how do we balance the human rights aspect, assuming the vaccine is available and enough time is given?
Maybe I can go in, because I think with the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are probably on the same page with this. Actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking perhaps you had read our statement on Monday, and we made it really clear that vaccination is a right to health response. There is no, I guess, binary or oppositional position in terms of that. Vaccination is critical for public health rights at this point. But we made it also very clear that you cannot deprive a person of their right to work through essential services, including health. The moment, as it stands, and as the Ministry of Health have tweeted yesterday, even before the 21st December deadline, they're now saying that you cannot receive in-person services from the state. And I think there needs to be some clarity within the Ministry of Health whether these measures start on the 21st of December, whether they are proposals, whether they're going to be legally enforceable, and for what duration are they going to last for. And I think this is Tieno's point, right? Is so that, are we saying that, come 22nd or 21st of December, if you haven't had your vaccination in full or partially, you will never get government services. I mean, does that mean for the next year? Does it mean that people should stop, visiting government offices from then on? Presumably, people will not be able to vote on August the 9th if it is left indeterminate in terms of the length of period. But I think the other area is the area of the freedom of movement.
If I can just ask you to qualify, because I can hear where you're going with this. What if government does enforce that edict or directive and say, until you're vaccinated, you can't access? Is that in compliance with human rights? Because they've made the vaccine available. There are some Kenyans who, for whatever reasons, are resisting.
When there's a question there, have they made it available?
No.
We have vaccines in the country.
I'm asking from a human rights perspective,
for how
assuming
long?
it's available, and assuming there are some Kenyans who are resisting, is it in compliance with human rights to deny Kenyans government services? And if it's not, then what response should we be having to these guidelines? How can they be made human rights compliant?
So I think the first thing to do is to look at, we can look comparatively globally across the world at the use of mandates. And you've given some examples of European countries. There are countries where this has been imposed as a government directive.
Yes.
There are other places where, like the United States of America, well, there's a federal order that all federal employees, all government employees must be vaccinated in order to continue working.
Yes.
And you have many large businesses, from Walmart and others who have basically declared that any employee that's not vaccinated cannot hold their job. But those are decisions of businesses in the U.S. I think what we have to be serious about and clear about, distinct about in terms of a mandate approach and a compulsory approach to vaccination is that our economy is essentially an informal economy. You've got 15 million people in the informal sector. Less than 3 million are in the formal sector. If KEPSA decided to rally behind this directive, it would only be able to enforce about, maybe 2-3 million people. 15 million people are in the informal sector. They are not going to essentially be compelled to do this if it means shutting down their small and medium enterprises, if it means shutting down their small restaurants and public spaces. And therefore, what you're left with, if I can just paint a predictable future, if there is an attempt to make this a legal directive, is that you will have police officers going into public spaces and literally asking people for their vaccination certificates and arresting them, or pulling them out of matatus and arresting them because they don't have vaccination certificates, in the way that we saw the curfew management go so badly wrong and so much brutality and corruption. So I think the point is, it's not just a human rights perspective in the legal sense. It's also a question about, is this a pragmatic, effective way of dealing with the issue of vaccine uptake? And I would argue, based on what we've seen globally and also based on what we know of the Kenyan economy, that this is not a policy that will be delivered effectively.
Then begs the question. Because we can postulate and we can talk about this and talk about. The question is, what ought we to do, right? Because here we are, and we've already had the fundamental thing being, we cannot run away from the importance of having everybody vaccinated. If we're talking about road to recovery, if we're talking about suggestions that have been made, whether it's from global bodies or government, one of the things that we've seen very clearly now, if we're getting on the road to recovery, that the economy must again be vibrant and robust. How are we going to be able to do that within a safe space? Is to keep people safe, health-wise. And one of the ways that we can do that is by vaccinating, right? We assume that government understands that, right? We assume that government understands that. We don't have
to assume it.
So the thing is,
we can hear it,
right? Okay, but the thing is here, and they're saying that we're saying. Sorry, there's a bit of a time. Sure. So we're saying that government, in their wisdom or otherwise, has said this is what we're asking you to do. We have seen that there has been a low uptake what then ought to be done? Because we can have these conversations in spaces where we say, well, it's trampling on human rights, it is not fair, it is illegal. What then, if we're going towards a solution-oriented conversation, what then must happen?
You know,
I think both of you, I get, and also Otieno, as well as from
the human rights approach.
What should be the approach? Because the truth of the matter is, people need to be vaccinated. We need to get this economy up and running again. We need people in formal sector to be back at work fully, while protected.
I have a couple of ideas, but maybe Otieno, you could jump in.
Sure.
You know, governments don't necessarily have to use force and threats. Governments can also use persuasion and explanation. I think a lot of times what we have seen the government do is to run away from explanation. So if somebody is questioning the efficacy of the vaccine or the safety of that vaccine, I think what we have seen in other countries, they engage with those people, provide explanation, provide evidence. But what we have seen in Kenya is that the government, rather than provide that explanation, it either preaches to people or threatens them or uses force. And we have seen this not just with vaccines, but many other things, including Huduma number.
And we know how that one ended up, didn't we?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You have some ideas, Irungu, of how this can happen, because we're looking at very short timelines. We're coming into December in a couple of days. This directive is coming out in the next 21. What you said you have some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is you know, I guess the phrase, you know, if CS Kagwe was listening and watching us now, I would say, listen, rally us, don't bully us. That's the first thing. For the political leaders who are organizing these large public rallies, and I noticed that they were left out of the directive, you know, can they...
Maybe they've been vaccinated. They vaccinated last year.
Yeah, but leadership is not self-protection. It is protecting your followers. And I think I would challenge, you know, particularly the leaders that are able to amass, whether by inducement or, you know, by love, these large rallies. Let them call the Ministry of Health to bring vaccination centers to their points of their rally. Let the faith leaders continue to make sure that vaccination centers are available in the churches. You know, about a month ago, my wife and I, we contributed from our income, and we rallied Kilimanians to basically organize a vaccination day for the elderly in Dagoretti North, and we paid this out of our own money. Because we felt that it was so important that the elderly in our community would be vaccinated, and hundreds of people came forward once it was made available. So that's the third thing. Amnesty, has been calling for our supporters and our members to vaccinate and to encourage other people to vaccinate. Could we see governors, for example, leading vaccination drives in the counties, particularly those counties that have very low levels of vaccination at this point? Can the minister, travel to a place like Garissa and Tana River and those counties that have very low uptake and be publicly seen to be encouraging people to vaccinate? Can the president, on his return from South Africa, hopefully he has got to see some comparative strategies because, COVID has hit South Africa very hard. Perhaps he can travel from Johannesburg to one of the northern counties and rally people there. The devolution conference, I think, is starting today. Today. Can we have a clear statement from 47 county governors?
Irungu will have a very clear statement, but if there's a group of people who actually need to be pushed and pushed to the point where they are actually mandated to do what they're supposed to do at the government and all these people you're mentioning, on their own, they do not take these matters seriously.
And can I ask a question that takes us back to the issue of accountability on the financing side? To what extent has the mismanagement of COVID funds dented public trust of government and trust in the COVID response? And what should be done to rebuild public confidence in the government's response? Because when you see huge amounts of money, billions, are lost through irregular tenders to politically connected people, and then the very same government is coming to coerce you into vaccination, there is a big gap. So what needs to be done on the accountability side to build confidence that we are on the same page on the COVID response? And I'm throwing that to both of you.
Allow me to, first of all, before I answer that question, to still go back to the issue of the measures the government is putting in place with regard to vaccination. You know, the government has a responsibility to treat everybody equally. And if you're putting in place measures and policies and laws, then enforce the laws across the board. If you begin to enforce the laws selectively, like now you say you can't hold public meetings beyond 100 people, but politicians hold
rallies of thousands
and nothing happens, that's a violation because it is discriminatory. There's a group of people who can get away.
But you know what is the rule? We can't hold rallies above how many people?
100
meetings.
100.
Yeah.
But you see, these are in the thousands, so it's a different category.
There is selective application.
Please go on, yes.
Or even the policies and measures there. So that is an area that the government needs to address because then some people feel like they are less of Kenyans than the others.
What needs to be done to restore confidence
in the COVID response from an accountability point of view?
Yeah, first of all, the accountability question is on several fronts. There's the financial front, and then there is the police abuses front. And then there is also just the other bit of public participation and communication, transparency. So the financial front, of course, it is allow the relevant agencies like the EACC to investigate properly. And then once that information comes out, like we saw that in the KEMSA scandal, they were saying 15 people needed to be prosecuted. You prosecute them. That one, we don't know where it is. Even though the information is there, we know who has been implicated. Nobody has gone to court. On the police front, it's a long-standing issue. When the government issued the curfew directive and the police were practicing out there doing push-ups, it looked like to them when they're sent out there to enforce anything, the only thing they know is to shoot.
Right.
But there's a lot more to policing than just shooting and beating. And that's a culture issue within the police that needs to be addressed. But beyond that, there's also an accountability question because the culture grows because they know that they can get away with it, they can do it, and nobody will ask. I will ask them.
I'm going to ask you, Irungu, because we're wrapping this up now in terms of what needs to be done to restore this confidence. In a short bit from you, Irungu, what needs to be done?
Well, I mean, I think Wanjiru is making a very legitimate point, right? Which is that, corruption and impunity is probably the single biggest virus in this country, and it has claimed more lives than COVID-19. If I can just be a bit dramatic about this, we see it in all the public health and education centers. Even the fact that we weren't able to respond very quickly to the virus is a consequence of the corruption that we've seen. So, she's making an important point. I think we can do two things simultaneously. We can demand accountability from the state, and we can vaccinate and encourage other people to vaccinate.
As well.
I don't think we should wait for one before we do the other. I think both of them are legitimate public health and anti-corruption, demands.
Right.
And we must make them simultaneously and vigorously.
Irungu,
to the next administration.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Otieno Namwaya, thank you as well for being part of this conversation with us today. Hopefully these accountability measures can rack up. Asante Sana, good morning. It's 8 o'clock.